Scott here with another episode of the History Unplugged podcast. If you live in a house in the United States that was built within the last 90 years, whether or not you realize it, it was probably influenced by one architect, and that's Frank Lloyd Wright. He designed over 1,100 buildings in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and swapped out European, Victorian, ornate designs with simpler buildings that featured open floor plans, and his goal was always to integrate with nature. Wright believed in home ownership and simple, affordable housing. He developed a series of prefab houses, basically creating the aesthetic of suburban America, so you're not straying too far away from architectural consensus if you say that American architecture definitively branched off from Europe thanks to him. He also championed using organic materials. You have him to thank for 2x4 studs instead of plaster in your walls. But what most people don't know is that Wright's style that informs almost all of American architecture today was forged in the Great Depression. Wright kept going despite the incredible limitations and the sort of materials that he was able to afford. The choices he made gave rise to his masterpiece, Fallingwater, a house in Pennsylvania built over a waterfall, and in the end, Wright stands alone as the only big-name architect to survive the Depression years. Today's guest is Catherine Ziff, author of Frank Lloyd Wright's Fallingwater, American Architecture in the Depression Era. We explore Wright's career at its lowest moment before his comeback as America's greatest architect. We look at how he was incredibly hardworking, but also hard to work with, how his constant envelope pushing of architecture made for designs that, while looked really impressive, were also prone to leaks, and how his vision very well influences the sort of house you live in today. Hope you enjoyed this discussion with Catherine Ziff. If you run up to somebody on the street and ask them to name one architect and they have almost no time to think, I would assume that 95 to 100% of people would say Frank Lloyd Wright, even if they know nothing else about him because they know the name, they know he's an architect. He is an influence on almost every aspect of American architecture. We'll drill down into exactly why, but for those who know very little about him besides the name, how would you describe his influence? What is American architecture before Frank Lloyd Wright and after him?
Well, that's a good question because Frank Lloyd Wright is really the quintessential American architect, and you're correct. He's the name that would come up if you ask, the average passerby on the street, name an American architect, he's the one they're probably most likely to come up with. His influence is not to, kind of pull an academic fast one on you, but he's a multifaceted influence. He has this really clear influence right at the start of his career in his Oak Park days, and he's widely well known for it. And that in and of itself would have been plenty to put himself in the history books. But then he has this just the most amazing comeback. And in the latter part of his career, he designed some of the buildings for which he's best known. And again, some of the most iconic buildings that the passerby on the street would know, things like the Guggenheim, things like Fallingwater. And so he really has this kind of almost bifurcated career that cuts him both ways. And I think it's his longevity that creates quite a lot of influence overall. So it's a good question to think about. Influence, kind of ebbs and flows a little bit, but it's really the totality of him that makes him so important.
Also, there are descriptions of him as the quintessential American architect and that he makes it independent of Europe. It gives America its own idiom. And me just saying that to architectural historians, that might make them roll their eyes because they would say, "Puh, what about pre-Columbian architecture? What, that doesn't exist?" Or, well, buildings are already taking on their own unique forms in 17th century Puritan New England or Virginia. There's always been a unique American architecture. And then someone will shoot back and say, yeah, sure, for rustic log cabins, but the grand buildings, the estate buildings are clearly looking at Europe the whole time. So it's not independent as you think. There's already an independent world, blah, blah, blah. I'm having my own debate by myself. So how much is American architecture looking to European architecture before Wright? 100%, 50%, depends on who you're looking at.
Well, thanks for the cop-out answer. Depends on who you're looking at. You're correct that is something that, in graduate school, we debate quite a bit, usually over some beer. And it's a good question to debate. I think you want to take America from the notion of when the American nation is created, so sort of 1776 and beyond, because before that, certainly there are influences of local traditions that fit in. And, what native cultures are building is, of course, entirely unique and entirely untouched by Europe. So, your first really, again, the academic answer is, well, what do you mean by American? But I think what you're really talking about more is the 19th century, where there is a conscious effort to define an American architecture. That's something that's really unique and new to the 19th century. As America, again, 1776, we disassociate ourselves from Europe. But then the question becomes, well, how do we do that architecturally? And again, these are in architectural circles. Other people are not necessarily thinking about this, but it is a question in architecture. And throughout the century, they float back and forth between different ideas, many of which do come from Europe. So Greek revival architecture seems to suit the American nation because it's a democracy, and that's the architecture of democracy. And then you have things like the Great Awakenings that touch on nature, which America has in spades. We have some really wonderful nature. And so the Gothic revival seems to suit that because that's a style that seems to fit well in nature and respect nature. And there are certainly plenty of overtones of religion that all come together. Nature, religion, and architecture all come together in the Gothic revival, and so forth and so forth. And so by the time you get to after the Civil War, you really have this kind of very fraught conversation about what the heck is American architecture. And the last piece of that is that the rise of engineering and new materials like steel make it possible to build just about anything. So now it's even more, oh my God, now what? What do we do? We could build little Chinese pagodas, and is that American? And how does that fit in and all of that? So this is really a very difficult and fraught conversation. And I would love to give Wright credit for being the first to really come up with a solution, but he's really not. It's Henry Hobson Richardson is the first to come up with what is considered to be the first quintessentially American style. And, your listeners can come back to me on that. But Richardson gets quite a lot of credit. And he designed in something called the Richardsonian Romanesque. And the most famous building that he did in that style is Trinity Church in Boston. But it was such a popular style that there's a little Richardsonian Romanesque in just about every city and town across America. So if your listeners have a late 19th century public library or a city or town hall, odds are good that that's in a Richardsonian Romanesque design, even if Richardson didn't do it. And he did do quite a bit all across the country. So I hail from Bristol, Rhode Island. Our town hall building, the Burnside building, is Richardsonian Romanesque, and our library is Richardsonian Romanesque. So yeah, that would be just something to take a quick, next time you're downtown, take a look. Where's your Richardsonian Romanesque building? Because they're out there. But Frank Lloyd Wright, he's the next one to do that, and he creates a very different style.
That style comes from his belief that form precedes function, that a building needs to support a lifestyle within. You're not creating a design without the thought of how are people going to use it. You're not just doodling a grand Roman-style temple or something influenced by the Agora and then putting up these incredible columns. And then at the very end, you might consider some of the entryways and making it fit to code. He's first thinking, how will this be used? And then building it from there. Can you flesh that out more? And then how does this fit into what a lot of art historians look at as his first career period from the Ward Willits House onto Midway Gardens?
So Wright's, he comes at architecture in a particularly distinct way, and that is that he is going to consider the lifestyle. How are you going to use this building? How are you going to live in this building? And for Wright, it's an idea he's really playing around with in his early career, but it's an idea that comes very much to fruition later on in his career. The lifestyle, and the building, and the architecture, and how you live in it, that is all one package for him. So when you occupy a Wright building, you commit to living in a certain way, and the building supports you living in that way. And this is the whole package that he is developing very early on with his style during what's often called the first part of his career is often called his Oak Park years. And he starts to flirt around with this idea of how do Americans live? And this is Wright's answer to the question of what is American about American architecture. Is it Americans live distinctly differently, he feels, and that the architecture in which they live, if you want to think about it as almost the stage set for the play or the container for living, there's a lot of different philosophies about this, and I don't want to go too esoteric on your poor listeners here, but that is the idea that he's thinking about, that the lifestyle and how you're going to live in this is very important. Form follows function is a way of thinking about it, but that has some other ideas wrapped up in it that have a little bit more to do with construction. And Wright's really about, do you play music? You need a music room. How do you sleep? Do you sleep warm? Do you sleep cold? He really thinks about a lot of those issues and creates his design in that way to respond to those issues. That's one thing that's unique about him.
The irony of the form before function is that, as you note, some of his houses were leaky monstrosities, which happens when you have all these different angles coming. And I clenched up a bit reading that, thinking as a typical suburban male doing weekends at Home Depot, having to prevent gaps in a roof or foundation repair, whatnot. And, well, I mean, things like that are going to happen when you have very creative designs and curvature or triangles all over the place. It's not typical for home design. So can you tell me about some of these interesting results from his design and also him personally? Because you can't talk about Wright without him being very hardworking, but also very hard to work with. So what were the results of some of his designs and what was it like to work with him?
Yeah, I think it's unfair to talk about Wright without talking about his own lifestyle, because that is what he asked of his clients. And so I do think they all kind of wrap together into the same package. Wright's buildings were notoriously difficult to live in. Some people really loved it. Some people, he had his fans. People like the Jacobs, they designed 2 houses with him and loved living in, they were heartbroken. They gave up the first one for reasons, but they were heartbroken about it and went back to him for a second one. And there were people who would live in Frank Lloyd Wright buildings all their lives, committed to the end of this is the greatest architecture in the world. And then there are people who just, couldn't wrap their head around it, didn't like it, didn't want to live that way. And the stories are legion. He gets a lot of flack for flat roofs, which he liked. And the other thing that he liked kind of not doing was gutters. He wasn't a big fan of gutters. So between the two, that can create some real trouble for the homeowner. And in his later years, when he's designing his Usonian houses, he really takes some structural risks and fixes them in kind of funny ways. So there's a house in Alabama that he designed that had a tremendously long cantilever. The cantilever is the structure that just extends way out, like, over the edge of something. And in a couple of cases, his cantilevers got a little too big. And in this particular house, he used a bunk bed in one of the bedrooms to help support this long cantilever. So if you can imagine for a quick second, that's a structural bunk bed. You can't move it. And these things are, if you're a homeowner who likes to move furniture around, a Wright house is not the one for you. He builds in his furniture. He has ideas about how you're going to live in it. He had been known to come into clients' houses and move some furniture around. And the stories kind of go on and on and on, like how upset he was when the Ennises, they built one of his concrete block designs and then filled it with Victorian furniture. And he was very unhappy, and they were unhappy. Everybody was unhappy. And then there's stories of the leaking. I have my own story about the leaking, which was just amusing. One of the last times I went to Fallingwater, the tour guide that was leading the tour says rather proudly to the group, "We only have 11 leaks today." I thought, oh dear. But the leaks were myriad, and really something that he's well known for. The joke about the Richard Jones house is, well, that's what happens when you leave a piece of art out in the rain, right? Like, you can get sort of, good laughs about it. But living in a Wright house really required commitment. He asked this of his clients. You had to commit to the way he was going to have you live in it. Some of them weren't up for it, but a lot of them were, and he really had his fans. And I think that's something that's important to know about Wright. He needed the right client in order to make this all happen. And that's really important. And just one last footnote, Wright himself, he walked the walk and talked the talk. He lived the way he intended to live. He was unapologetic about how he lived, and he really was prepared to put his money where his mouth is. So, he didn't ask something of his clients that he wasn't prepared to do himself. And I do think there's many reasons to criticize Wright, but that's not one of them. He had integrity about his buildings and his lifestyle in its own way.
It sounds like living in one of his buildings is like going to a 3-star Michelin restaurant where you do not ask the chef to modify the menu because he would consider it a work of art, and modifying it fundamentally changes it. So if you don't like it, then just leave. It's a partnership between the creator and the one who consumes it. So don't just demand exactly what you want because the creator had something very specific in mind. And I would imagine being a structural engineer with Wright would be a nightmare, since he imagines something and then thinks, okay, I'm going to go out and do it, which is what makes his design so idiosyncratic, because he is constantly pushing the envelope and then sometimes going on the fly trying to see if it can be supported or not. And is this a reason why there are things like so many leaks in his buildings, or sometimes iffy foundational issues, because he's pushing the envelope so far with what he's trying to do?
Absolutely. I mean, Wright was an extraordinarily well-read man. His work ethic, even into his 80s, was unparalleled. I mean, he would get up early, he would do work early, he read everything. He was very well-informed and would work up until, into the evenings. And then typically the end of the day at Taliesin was music. So he kept quite a rigid lifestyle. He knew a lot, he read a lot, and in his mind, when he saw something could work, he would make it work. He really would work on if he took it from the idea from an engineering standpoint, because he was not an engineer, but he understood, he had an innate understanding of how engineering should work. And so when he got it in his head that this should work, he would make it work. Now, what that means is sometimes he would employ an engineer, and an engineer would, just kind of go to town and everything would be great. But in other times, that meant that, kind of would work things out on the spot. And a good example of that is his concrete block buildings in Los Angeles, which are wildly quirky buildings. You really want to envision your typical concrete masonry unit building that you've seen a million times. Maybe your garage is made out of it, or your school, except that the face of the brick is fancy. And he worked with this idea for quite a number of years, again, operating under the idea that, this should work. Why doesn't this work? And he ran into all kinds of problems that he didn't really know enough about to know quite what to do. So one of them was, what is the correct mixture for the concrete that will make this work? And so there was a fair amount of experimentation on the ground as he's building the house. He would often also change his mind. So he might say, I've decided those windows should be 2 inches smaller. So the process of creating a Wright building, they often, you could count on them to go long. You could count on them to go over budget. And oftentimes the clients are kind of trapped in the middle. So the Hanna house is a good example. The Hannas got partway through this construction and it started to run out of money. But they're halfway through. What do? You can't stop. You're not going to rebuild. So, sometimes the clients really were over a barrel. But many of them were very excited to work with him about this. Some clients were total partners in this design process. And again, the Jacobs were absolutely partners and, got down in the trenches with him and worked with him on it. But others were not. Others really wanted him to do it. And he was not the architect for everybody.
In the early 20th century, almost any design is possible thanks to steel, new materials that make buildings taller than they could ever be, angles that they never could have been with traditional design. But there's a new limitation with the Great Depression. And you open your book with the story of your grandparents making a deposit in a bank that almost immediately fails. Everyone is facing devastation and limits. This includes architects, the entire field of architecture, and Wright himself. How does the Depression affect architecture in the 30s, and how does this affect Wright personally? Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a short break for a word from our sponsors.
Well, architecture in the Depression is really sort of, non-existent. The magnitude with which the Depression hits the architecture field is staggering, and it really pretty much brings the entire field to a halt. And it's not just that it puts architects out of business. It's really that there's no building at all, which means that the engineers are out of business and the plumbers are out of business and the electricians are out of business. Everybody is, there's a whole cascade of jobs that happen once there is no longer funding for these large projects. Large projects, for example, at the time, many of them are skyscraper projects. So the Empire State Building is one of the few that is able to move forward, but there's a lot of other projects that are simply canceled. So just some statistics to mark the magnitude of how bad the Depression is for architects and building. The crash, as your audience surely knows, happens in October 1929. By 1933, business investment is down 90%. Stocks have lost 85% of their value. Foreign trade has declined from 10 billion to 3 billion. Unemployment is at 25%, but rumored to be much higher. And 1.5 million people are homeless. So it's a depression the likes of which we've only had glimpses of in the past 20 years. People say, well, this is the worst thing since the Depression, but the Depression itself was really quite awful. For architecture in particular, Architectural Record quotes that 85% of the architects in New York City were unemployed. Again, that's probably a low number. I mean, there's just nobody's able to really build anything. And it's just, it's devastating. It's devastating. Many major architects, this is it. They fold up their careers and call it a day. Many of them are on the older end of things anyway. Somebody like John Russell Pope is in his 80s. So, many of them call it a day. But there's a bunch of them that are younger that just can't make it through. And Wright's really the exception, which is what I think is one of the things that's really remarkable about him, is he's the only architect of his time to really make it through the Depression on the other end, and then to have such success on the other end. What marks the difference, we talked about, is his Oak Park years, where he's really, building this career. On the other side is Fallingwater and the Guggenheim, the buildings for which he's really best known, although he's known for some very early works as well. And what's right in between is the Depression. So I think it's something that's really a remarkable almost before and after event. And he's one of the few to have an after the Depression. Wright's career is, it's a mess before the Depression. The question of how the Depression affected him is an interesting one, because in some ways it didn't affect him and in some ways it did affect him. Throughout the 20s, and this is something Wright is well known for, in 1908, he left his wife and 6 children and ran off with the wife of a client, was very happy with her. But from that moment, his personal life was just filled with scandalous ups and downs. He would continually be making the papers, and it just keeps getting, never really settles down until the Depression. And for those who know Frank Lloyd Wright, you probably know some of these events. In 1914, a servant goes crazy and murders his wife and her children and burns his beloved Taliesin home flat to the ground. It's devastating. In the 1920s, he marries a second wife and she turns out to be mentally unstable. Finally meets the final love of his life, only to have the second wife fail to divorce him. Can't work. Commissions are pulled from him. He goes bankrupt twice. And the 20s are really unkind to Wright. He has a difficult time in the 20s. And what's so tragic about him is by 1929, he's really regrouped and he's put all his personal issues behind him and he's stable and he's bought back Taliesin and he's getting ready to marry this third love. And then the Depression hits. And so in some sense, it's tragic because he had a lot of plans and they all went. Nothing, I think there's one commission that he has that manages to outlast the crash. But the fact is he doesn't have all that much work to begin with. So it's a little bit of, he kind of gets off easy in some ways for the Depression. And so he's a little unique in that sense. And that's part of what I think positions him to survive the Depression, is he's just so used to, he's had, a decade and a half of kind of practicing architecture without practicing architecture. And I think that's part of how he gets through the Depression, is he knows how to, kind of be an architect without actually building anything.
His experience designing almost every shape imaginable, using every material imaginable, makes him incredibly resourceful, which you need to be to survive and even thrive in the Depression, which he does. This brings us to Fallingwater, the real heart of your book. Can you tell me about its origin and the design that Wright and his client, Edgar J. Kaufman, came up with in response to the limitations of the Depression?
So the Fallingwater was actually not the building that brought E.J. Kaufman and Wright together. In fact, it was a set of Depression-era New Deal projects that brought the two together. The answer, what happens to the field of architecture is the New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt kind of builds his way out of this economic depression. And in doing so, he reinvents the type of things that are going to be built. So the architecture is revived around all sorts of public infrastructure projects. And EJ, and that's Edgar J. Kaufman, Sr., contacts Wright initially about a bridge and tunnel project that he and the local businessmen in Pittsburgh are working on. They're going after New Deal money to the tune of some $34 million, and it's going to be a make-work project. And he reaches out to Wright about that. And Wright is initially skeptical, and with good reason, because Wright he's done bridges, but he's never done like a Brooklyn Bridge kind of a thing. He's never done that. And so he's initially quite skeptical, but EJ is charming and Wright is charming. And I think really together, they made magic. I think they were just the perfect client-architect match out there. And so what I think happens, because this is, all sort of, lost to history, is I think that there were a lot of conversations, and I think that the two of them could kind of build castles in the sky pretty easily. So they go from talking about bridges and tunnels to talking about a planetarium to talking about redoing EJ's office. And then eventually, it's like the last thing they talk about is a new house out on this property that Kaufman has owned for about 2 decades or so. He's had this property. And interestingly, all those other projects fall away. And it is the Fallingwater design, the house out on the vacation property, that survives as kind of the final castle in the sky that the two of them are building. The Depression cut both ways for them. On the one hand, E.J. Kaufman was the owner of Kaufman's department store, and department stores were one of the few areas in the Depression that managed to survive. Kaufman's is still hit hard. They still have many economic issues to worry about, but EJ in general is one of the few people that has money. And the Kaufmans themselves were a wealthy family. So in some senses, Wright had kind of, carte blanche of a blank checkbook, kind of. I mean, EJ did rein him in a bit, but like any other typical Wright building, the design, EJ spent a lot more money than Wright told him he was going to spend. Initially, it went way over budget. On the other hand, because it was the Depression, it was easy to find workmen that would work for less. It was easy to find materials for less. So there were ways to cut costs. And that's one of the, I think, the interesting things about Fallingwater, and it's something that people are quick to overlook, is it is a Depression-era building. It's built squarely in the Depression, and yet it doesn't look it. So I think it's easy to overlook that really, frankly, very important context.
Listeners, if you can take a moment and look on Google Images for Fallingwater, if you see images and you're not aware of it, you'll probably recognize it the second you see it. And you've probably had a coworker mention a trip out to see this house. I've probably heard it from 5 or 10 people over the years talking about the waterfall that goes underneath it. It looks like a scaffold house that arose completely out of nature in a Pennsylvania forest with a river running underneath it. You'll know it when you see it. With that in mind, could you be our tour guide if you were leading us through? How would you describe Fallingwater? And in light of these particular Depression circumstances, what were elements of the house that were made in direct response to the conditions of the Depression?
Fallingwater's design consists of a set of trays. So think like cookie trays with a little lip around the edge. And they're stacked up kind of at right angles to each other, sitting on a set of stone boulders. And the trays themselves they're actually kind of an ochre color. They're a little bit of a yellowy white kind of a color. And so they both contrast and fit in with the stonework. The stonework was important. The trays are balanced on the stonework and kind of tied to the stonework. And so it does get that feeling that you were just describing a minute ago about how it kind of seems to kind of come out of nature itself. Wright did very little to change the site plan. So he worked with all the boulders as they were in place. He set the house over the waterfall the way he intended. And so he really fit the building into the nature that was there. Wright was a nature aficionado. He really loved nature. And so that is one of the hallmarks of his design is if your site had something uniquely natural about it, he would work very hard to incorporate that into your structure. And so he worked around trees. He would build, say, a balcony around a tree, or a pergola would wrap around the trees. He would create spaces for the trees, which today can be a little funky because some of the trees aren't there anymore. But he really worked very hard to make the building, the architecture, wrap around the nature that was there. And so when you walk through Fallingwater, and I would encourage everybody to do this, to go and visit Fallingwater, I honestly think, I know this is a little crazy thing to say, but I honestly think that Fallingwater has the best gift shop design that I've ever really seen. It totally sets the tone for what you're about to see and creates an experience because you walk from the gift shop to the house. So you will approach the house going through the landscape. And so you start with this feeling of, oh, okay, this is what the Bear Run landscape is about. This is the stream that has the waterfall. And then you kind of turn the corner through the rhododendrons and there's the house. And it kind of, has this sort of sneaking up on you. And then all of a sudden it's there, feeling to it. So as you walk through the house, you'll find yourself very connected with nature. The floors are flagstone floors. So it feels like, kind of like you're on the bottom of the river. The windows are ribbon windows. So you're looking directly out over the river and the landscape and the waterfall. You hear the waterfall echoing through the building. The stonework the walls are rough cut stonework. So you feel again like the boulders have tied their way through the building. And even in front of the fireplace, the boulder that the house is balanced on, there's one big boulder and then several little boulders that it's tied to. And Wright allowed the top of the boulder to kind of come up a little bit in front of the hearth. So again, you feel like the house is settled in nature and that, really nature's given primacy. So it's a very unique experience, and I really would encourage everybody to go. The boulder in front of the fireplace, by the way, leaving that to kind of crop up was actually E.J. Kaufman's idea. So again, this client who really understood what Wright was going for and was prepared to really live that way, but also to make his own contributions. And he did. E.J. contributed a lot to the design.
The big question is the influence of this house in particular and Frank Lloyd Wright in general on American architecture. Let's look at this through a narrow lens and then a wide lens. The narrow lens, this particular building, after its design, its completion, what was its influence right in the heart of the Depression when architecture is only beginning to be rebooted through efforts like the New Deal Civilian Conservation Corps to get the United States back to work? It really kicks into high gear in World War II. But this house in particular, what is its influence in the years after its completion?
Well, its influence is right away startling. It is a remarkable house. I could certainly wax on about the engineering of the house, which is its own remarkable story. But it was a remarkable house right from the outset, and it was recognized by the clients, by Wright, by the architecture community, by the art community, by the engineering community, and then really ultimately by the American population very quickly. It's published in Time magazine, it's published in Architectural Record. And so its influence is almost immediate. And what I think happens is I think it strikes a chord with America. I think America has been down for 5 or 6 years now with this depression. It's been a slow and steady climb out. And it isn't really, in America, by the way, doesn't ever really get out of the depression until World War II production. World War II production really kind of finalizes the end of the depression. But America, I think the country's been down and out. To also mention is that the Dust Bowl is happening at this time. So, I mean, it's a kind of a bleak time for America, and they needed a win. And I think that's what Fallingwater was. I think people looked at Fallingwater even in, 1939, 1940 and said, there you go. Good old-fashioned American ingenuity has created something entirely new. I mean, there's certainly some attempts to imitate it, but there's really never been anything quite like it. And I think that they looked at an American-born architect and an American client with, department store, very, very American fortune created. And they built something truly, truly remarkable. And on top of that, it's a gorgeous building. I mean, the pictures were beautiful. The renderings that Wright released were beautiful. It's one of the top photographed buildings out there. It even today continues to make top 10 best buildings in America lists. If it's not at number 1, it's at number 2. And I can't honestly think what it would be behind if it were number 2. So right off the bat, I think its influence is widely known. And it's interesting because Wright was quite nervous about the design and he kept it private. He initially wasn't going to publicize it right away. He had other plans for the publicity that ended up going to Fallingwater. He had other plans for it. So it's really, even he, I think, was it's a very structurally daring building. I think even he was nervous about it. But once the secret's out, he kept it very quiet. And once the secret's out, though, I mean, everybody just adores it. So it's a win for America at a time when America really needs it.
Right here, one more break for a word from our sponsors. You note that Wright isn't doing something radically different, at least for him with this building. It was what he had been saying and what he had been doing for decades, focusing on how to integrate a building with nature, rejecting European modernism. The difference is that in the Depression, people have ears to hear and listen to him in a way they didn't before when he's trying to redefine what a building could and should encompass. So can you describe the long-term legacy of Wright, and during the Depression, he designs this building and how it changes American architecture and how America expresses itself through buildings?
Yeah, you're correct that Wright is really singing this. He's sending this message of how you're going to live. He is quite consistent in the message that he's sending about how architecture and building and lifestyle all need to come together. What changes, though, twofold. One is that the conversation changes, and it's the Depression that changes it, right? In the 1920s, we have all of these revival styles. America's, especially in the West, there's a big building boom happening in the 1920s that Wright is really just kind of categorically left out of. And what's being built are things like the Chrysler Building, a big Art Deco skyscraper in New York, a lot of modernism in Los Angeles, a lot of traditionalism in Los Angeles. Los Angeles is really booming. And Wright is in Los Angeles, and I think it really speaks to the fact that the architecture profession in general, but people in general as well, just aren't able to really hear his message. And what he's building at this time, and we talked about the Ennis House, it's a little kooky. The concrete block designs are a little kooky, and if you have a chance to get in one, you'll kind of see they're inevitably the concrete block designs in Los Angeles are like the evil lair, right? So for those who are Buffy the Vampire Slayer fans, Angel's Lair is the Ennis House. And I see them quite often coming up as, kind of evil, dark spaces. They're kooky spaces. They're not actually evil spaces. They're actually really quite interesting spaces. But I think they're very difficult to envision living in, as the Ennis's tried with their Victorian furniture, and it didn't really work. So, two things happened for Wright in the Depression that I think really relaunch him. One is that the Depression simply changes how architecture is practiced. It's kind of almost a clearing of this, just a total clearing away of the old and a bringing in of the new. But at the same time, Wright himself manages to come a little closer to what people are thinking about. And I think Fallingwater is emblematic of that. It's not, kooky is not a word to describe Fallingwater. It's a much more, he moves his aesthetics in a way that is more palatable to American clients. And so the long-lasting influence that he has is that it relaunches his career. He's learned a bit about what clients can and will support, right? An architect is really only as good as his clients. And after Fallingwater is built and publicized and it gets in, like I said, it's on Life magazine, all of these popular magazines that people are seeing, and he gets calls from those magazines right away. I mean, he's building new buildings right away. And in fact, in the end, he's an extraordinarily prolific architect. He builds some 650 buildings, and a third of them happen in the later years of his life when he's an older architect after Fallingwater is constructed. It's a whole third of his career that happens to him. And this is really, I think, the Wright that we know the best. This is the Wright that we single out as the American architecture. If his career had stopped He would never have built Fallingwater. He would never have built the Guggenheim. He would never have built, some, 150 little houses for people called Usonian houses. If his career had stopped at the Depression, he would never have been the great architect that we know him as. I think the first part of his career he would have was a good architect and he would have made it into the history books without a doubt, but he would never have been that iconic American architect that we single him out for today. So I think that the long-lasting influence of Fallingwater is really important. I think it's what gave us our hero architect. It's just what made him America's architect.
One last question on the influence of Frank Lloyd Wright. Where do we see his influence today? And let me give a perspective of someone who doesn't know much about architecture, and I'll present a pessimistic view that, in one sense, an architect's vision is dead. If you look at any downtowns all look the same, at least in the United States. The only way they can be differentiated are by iconic buildings that were built decades or centuries beforehand. If you see videos produced by Chamber of Commerce from a city, they'll highlight downtown hipster millennial zoomer places that look the same from one place to another. I saw a video mocking this trend a few years ago, trying to highlight Lincoln, Nebraska, that, oh, look at this cool downtown space where there's co-working, there's new brew pubs, barcades, all this stuff, but it looks exactly the same and as cookie cutter as any other mid-sized city you can ever imagine. And there's nothing to distinguish a downtown hipster zoomer Lincoln, Nebraska from a Cincinnati, from a Redding, California, and it all blends together. So unique vision like Wright is dead. So that's a pessimistic view, but
yeah, it's pretty darn pessimistic.
It is. So I guess I'm supposed to be devil's advocate here, but in light of that, how would you see that the light of an architect's vision is still being kept alive?
Well, okay, let me begin with Wright, and I'm an optimist, just to let you know. Wright, he was not a big fan of cities. So this phenomenon that you're talking about is actually something he'd kind of be on board with. He, again, during the Depression, creates this project called Broadacre City, where everybody is going to live out on their acre plot, and we're going to use cars to drive to different places, and the factories will be spread out in different places as the office parks, as the industrial sites. And this should all sound very familiar because, in fact, this vision is part of what has come to pass. And Wright isn't the only one thinking about it, right? I don't want to blame Wright for suburbanization, but he's one of several voices talking about how the automobile suburbs will, change our world. And to see downtowns empty out a bit is something that Wright would be in some support of. He wanted people to live in nature. His objections to cities were that they were kind of cold and, unnatural and too much infrastructure and too many people living together. And he wants people to have ownership of their own lives. So he wants everybody to own their own house on their own, acre of property out in the landscape, and we'll all have a car and it'll all be democratic. And, the idea falls apart very, very quickly, right? As we now know, there's a lot of problems with suburbanization. There's a lot of good about suburbanization, but there's a lot of bad about suburbanization. And, again, his ideas weren't going to last for very long anyway. But one of the effects of suburbanization, as you rightly point out, is that cities got less dense and a lot of business got pulled away from them. And so I actually think, I'm a big fan of local history. And I really think that there are distinctions between Lincoln, Nebraska and, Oakland, California from an architecture perspective. And it harkens back to something that Wright would absolutely highlight, and that is the community that is in these spaces. If the architecture is the stage set for living, then it's really for the community to figure out how to reuse their buildings. I have been in my past deemed the pragmatic preservationist, and I am a preservationist and I am pragmatic, that's for sure. But I do think that really what the architect's role is today is to repurpose these buildings. I think there's very few clean slates. Wright was lucky to have at least a perceived clean slate, even if not an actual one. He had the opportunity to build in cities where there were new cities, like the farmland becomes community. And so he has that opportunity to build. And I think those opportunities now for architects are, really almost non-existent. There's just isn't, everything's built, I think. And so to me, the challenge of an architect today is adapting and reusing. And that requires a considerable knowledge of local history. What was this building before? What should it be now? How can the community best use it? These are conversations that need to happen from the community itself with the architect in charge. And this is all something that Wright would be very much in favor of, right? Engage the architect to help us understand how we live today and how those buildings can enhance that. I think those are all conversations Wright would enjoy having, frankly. But of course, he'd want it his way.
Well, much better to end on a positive note. And I think there's a lot to consider if people are interested in architecture, what it means for the future, a lot of lessons from the past, and especially if you're operating under strict limitations and how to work within them creatively. Well, Catherine, thank you for discussing all this. And if listeners want to check out her book, the name of it is Frank Lloyd Wright's Fallingwater, American Architecture in the Depression Era. Catherine, thank you for joining us. All right, that is all for today's episode. If you'd like to see show notes for this and all my other episodes and include sources, maps, or other relevant information, go to parthenonpodcast.com. Parthenon is the name of the podcast network that History Unplugged is a part of, along with other great history shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History, Steve Guerra's Beyond the Big Screen and History of the Papacy, and other shows as well. If you'd like to support History Unplugged, there are two easy ways to do so. The first is to subscribe to the show on the podcast player of your choice and leave a review. This really helps the show grow. The second thing is to join our membership program on Patreon. And if you do so, you can get completely ad-free episodes of the entire back catalog of the show, which is 600 episodes and growing. Just go to patreon.com/unplug. Thanks for listening and see you next time.